A Jeep crashing through my fence at 7:30 in the morning wasn't exactly the wake-up call I'd planned for a Sunday, but apparently, my neighbor Karen had other ideas. The first thing I heard was the groan and snap of aged cedar boards, followed by the kind of revving that sounds like someone is about to claim victory in a demolition derby held exclusively for the sleep-deprived. I rolled out of bed, heart already beating fast, only to see the back end of her mud-spattered Jeep wriggling like an angry beast through the gaping hole in my backyard's border. Bits of my fence clung to her bumper, swinging like a grotesque parade flag as she gunned it back onto her own driveway. There was no mistaking the wild eyes glaring at me through her windshield, nor the white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. That was Karen, all right. If there was a rule to break or a property line to ignore, she'd do it before her morning coffee and find a way to blame you for the mess. I yanked on a hoodie, still half asleep and totally barefoot, and sprinted outside just as she was climbing out of the Jeep with the slow, dramatic flair of a reality TV star bracing for a close-up. She looked me up and down, as if the carnage in my yard was somehow an inconvenience for her. "You really ought to fix that fence, you know," she said, jerking her thumb toward the splintered wreckage as if she was being helpful. "It's an eyesore, and it's clearly not safe for the neighborhood." She wrinkled her nose and made a big show of brushing imaginary dirt off her capris, never mind the literal trail of debris she'd left behind. I stared at her, dumbfounded, and then let out a short laugh. The kind that escapes when you're not sure whether you're being punked or standing in some twisted HOA-themed comedy. Now, to truly understand Karen, you have to know that she's not just any neighbor. She's the unofficial, self-appointed president of our street. No, there's no HOA, she just acts like there is, wielding her imagined authority like a scepter forged from passive aggression and next-door app rants. Every mailbox is inspected, every blade of grass critiqued, every visitor interrogated if they park for more than 15 seconds. And of course, if there's ever a rule broken, Karen's the first to document it on her phone and the last to ever admit fault herself. Her Jeep, oversized and always double-parked, was like her royal carriage. If carriages could leave tire marks on your petunias. I stared at the splintered fence, mentally calculating what it would cost to fix, and wondered if I could get away with using some leftover plywood and a bucket of super glue. But Karen's voice snapped me back to the present. "I was just trying to avoid those raccoons," she insisted, as if veering into private property at 20 miles per hour was the rational, neighborly solution to wildlife. "You really should take care of that, too. They're probably attracted by your garbage." I almost asked if she wanted to write me a ticket while she was at it. For a moment I considered calling the police. But I know Karen's game, she'd spin it so fast, I'd probably be cited for fence entrapment or some other nonsense. No, if there was one thing I'd learned from years of living next door, it was that escalation is both her fuel and her Achilles heel. So instead, I took a deep breath and let my sarcasm do the heavy lifting. "Thanks for the feedback," I told her, keeping my voice as flat as the 2x4s now scattered across my lawn. "I'll get right on that. Maybe next time just use the road like everyone else." She snorted, turned on her heel, and stomped back inside, slamming the door behind her with a flourish that rattled her decorative garden gnome. I stood in the morning chill, surveying the destruction, and decided right then that if Karen wanted a neighborhood spectacle, I'd give her one she wouldn't forget. My approach would be patient, meticulous, and utterly devoid of the explosive drama she lived for. If there was a long game to play, I was ready. The day wore on as I gathered up fence boards and tried to tape together some semblance of a barrier, if only to keep my dog from exploring Karen's weed-choked azaleas. Word traveled fast in our little corner of suburbia, and by the afternoon, 2 more neighbors had wandered over, each carrying a mug of coffee and the sort of look you get when your favorite soap opera takes a particularly wild turn. "Heard the commotion this morning," Mr. Holland said, peering over his glasses at the mangled boards. "You call the cops yet?" I shrugged, gave a noncommittal smile, and replied, "Thought about it. Figured I'd let the universe handle it." Beside him, Mrs. Alvarez shook her head and muttered something about how her son used to date Karen's daughter, and that the apple hadn't fallen far from the tree. That evening, as I picked splinters out of my palms and tried not to think about the expense, I watched Karen from my kitchen window. She was on her phone in the driveway, gesticulating wildly and glaring in my direction. At one point, she walked over to her Jeep, pointed at a tiny scratch on the bumper, presumably from my fence, and snapped several photos, angling the camera for maximum drama. I had no doubt she'd be posting those to the neighborhood group chat within the hour, probably with a caption about dangerous, poorly maintained fences endangering children and pets. The urge to roll my eyes was nearly overpowering. But I had a different plan. I made a few calls that night, reaching out to a friend who owed me a favor or two from my days working construction. I figured if Karen wanted to play demolition derby with my property, she should get a taste of what real heavy equipment could do. The next morning, I texted my friend. "Remember that bulldozer you mentioned needing storage for?" I wrote. "I've got just the spot." The response was immediate, a thumbs-up emoji followed by, "When do you want it dropped off?" I smiled for the first time all weekend. That night, I lay in bed, mentally replaying the day's events, and realized this was bigger than just a fence. It was about principle, about not letting the loudest voice on the street dictate how the rest of us live. If Karen wanted to bulldoze her way through life, maybe it was time she learned what it felt like to be on the receiving end. Tomorrow, I thought, as I drifted off to sleep, tomorrow things would get interesting. The morning after the Jeep incident, I woke to the rumble of heavy machinery, not from Karen's yard, but from the flatbed truck idling at the curb in front of mine. It was a ridiculous, over-the-top sight, a full-sized yellow bulldozer gleaming in the sunlight, its blade stretching wider than Karen's entire driveway. My friend from construction, Frank, waved from the cab of the truck, his grin making it clear that he was enjoying every second of this little delivery. I walked out, coffee in hand, and tried to suppress my own smirk as Frank hopped down. "This the infamous property line?" he asked, nodding toward the mangled fence and the Jeep tire tracks that still snaked through my backyard. "She's got nerve," he said, voice low but not quite a whisper. "Yeah, you could say that," I replied, eyeing Karen's windows for the twitch of a curtain or the glint of a cell phone camera. "Think you can wedge that thing onto her driveway?" Frank grinned even wider. "Buddy, I could parallel park this in a phone booth." I watched as he unloaded the bulldozer, guiding it off the ramp with all the casual confidence of a man who'd done this 100 times. The machine thudded onto the asphalt, leaving tracks in the dew, and I had to admit, there was something deeply satisfying about the way it dwarfed Karen's immaculate flower beds and matched her Jeep for pure intimidation factor. Karen, predictably, did not disappoint. Within seconds, her front door flung open and she stormed out, still in her bathrobe, slippers slapping against the concrete. Her face was a mosaic of outrage and disbelief. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, marching straight up to Frank as he hopped down from the cab. "That's private property. You can't just park a construction vehicle here." Her voice rose on every word, practically echoing off the neighbor's siding. Frank, unfazed, tipped his cap and nodded toward me. "You'll want to talk to the owner about that," he said, not unkindly, before heading back to his truck. I could feel the tension gathering around us like a thundercloud. "Morning, Karen," I said, adopting the tone I reserved for telemarketers and especially persistent raccoons. I needed a place to store it while my fence gets repaired. "Figured this spot was perfect since you already cleared the path." Her eyes narrowed, darting between me and the bulldozer. "You're blocking my Jeep," she hissed. "I have places to be. Important places." She drew herself up, wrapping her bathrobe tighter as if it were a judge's robe and she was ready to pronounce sentence. I leaned against the bulldozer and sipped my coffee, enjoying the moment far more than I should have. "Oh, don't worry," I said. "Frank'll move it in a couple days. Just waiting on materials for the new fence." I let the words hang there, knowing full well that Karen's definition of a couple days was measured in minutes, not hours. "It's not staying here," she insisted, voice trembling with the effort of keeping herself civil. "I'll call the police." I shrugged, putting on my most innocent expression. "Go ahead. It's not blocking the street. Not violating any city ordinances. Just park. Like your Jeep was, until it wasn't." At that exact moment, Mrs. Alvarez appeared on her front porch, coffee cup in hand, taking in the scene like she'd just tuned in for the morning soap opera. A few houses down, I saw Mr. Holland peering over his hedge, phone held aloft and recording. I wasn't the only one who'd had enough of Karen's reign of terror, it seemed. Karen noticed the growing audience, her cheeks coloring with the sudden awareness that, for once, she wasn't in control of the narrative. Still, she wasn't the type to back down. She stalked back to her house, muttering about lawsuits and city officials, already dialing someone before her door even closed. As the day dragged on, the Bulldozer became an instant neighborhood attraction. Kids slowed their bikes to stare, neighbors walked their dogs a little slower past my yard, and a few even stopped to chat under the pretense of checking on my fence. Every single one of them shot a quick glance at Karen's window, like she might appear at any moment with a fresh list of demands or a lecture about property values. By noon, the spectacle had already made its way to the local Facebook group, where someone posted a picture with the caption, "Neighborhood drama levels, maximum." Meanwhile, Karen spent the day in full crisis mode. I spotted her pacing back and forth in her living room, phone glued to her ear, gesturing so wildly that even her cat fled for cover. At one point, a police cruiser did show up, lights flashing but siren off. I walked over to meet the officer, already feeling the nerves in my stomach start to tingle. Karen was right behind him, arms folded, lips pressed tight in satisfaction. "Officer," she began, "this is an eyesore. It's a violation of—" The officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, as long as the vehicle is properly parked and not blocking emergency access, there's no law against it. If you have an issue with your neighbor, you'll need to resolve it civilly." He shot me a sympathetic glance, and I nodded, keeping my expression as neutral as possible. Karen was seething, her righteous indignation cut off at the knees. But the property values," she sputtered. The officer gave a weary sigh and handed her a pamphlet about mediation, which she snatched like he'd handed her a subpoena. As he left, he gave me a subtle thumbs up behind his back. I didn't smile, but I think he could tell I wanted to. That afternoon, the Bulldozer cast a long shadow over Karen's precious rosebushes, and I found myself fielding more supportive comments than I'd ever gotten since moving in. Neighbors who'd barely waved before now offered sympathy and suggestions, some even dropping off homemade cookies or drink. Apparently, my storage solution had struck a chord. Karen, however, was plotting. I caught glimpses of her speaking to a man in a cheap suit on her front porch. Her real estate agent, probably, and later saw her walking the property line with a yellow tape measure, talking into her phone. By dinner time, she had escalated things to a new level. A group text went out to the whole street, accusing me of menacing her with dangerous machinery and warning of unpredictable, destructive behavior from my household. Most of the neighbors ignored it. A few replied with laughing emojis. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But Karen's not the type to back down. Just before sunset, she showed up at my door, hair perfect and attitude sharpened to a razor's edge. She handed me a letter, freshly printed and bristling with legalese, threatening to sue me for public nuisance, property devaluation, and emotional distress. I read the whole thing standing there in the doorway, nodded and said, "Thanks, I'll pass this to my lawyer." She blinked, as if she hadn't considered the possibility I might have one. "You'll hear from me soon," she warned and stormed off. After she left, I texted my friend Frank a picture of her letter, and he replied with a string of laughing faces. I put the letter on my fridge, right next to last year's HOA newsletter, where Karen had volunteered to keep our neighborhood beautiful. The irony was delicious. That night, as the bulldozer's shadow crept up Karen's driveway, I sat on my porch and watched the sun go down, wondering just how far she'd be willing to go, and how much further I'd have to push to finally make her see that this wasn't just about a fence. It was about respect. And I had a feeling that Karen's threat of legal action could have ruined my week, if I didn't know her lawyer was the same guy who sent cease and desist letters to neighborhood kids for sidewalk chalk. Still, I wasn't naive. People like Karen win by wearing you down with relentless complaints, not by going to court. Her strategy was to grind me into submission by flooding every channel with drama until the rest of the block sided with her just to restore peace. But for once, the balance had shifted. Every time someone passed the bulldozer, I could feel the pulse of silent support. For neighbors who'd tiptoed around her for years, seeing her lose her grip was like watching someone finally turn off a car alarm that had been blaring for days. Still, I knew I couldn't get comfortable. The storm was coming, and Karen had only just begun her campaign. That Monday, I woke up to a fresh set of emails from the city's code enforcement office, each one more bureaucratic than the last. Apparently, Karen had filed half a dozen complaints about the industrial equipment hazard, visual blight, excessive noise, and, for good measure, potential environmental contamination from hydraulic fluid leaks. There was even one about psychological distress for her indoor cat, Princess, who'd been seen glaring at the bulldozer through the living room blinds. The emails requested photos, descriptions, and documentation. I replied to each one with a level of deadpan helpfulness that bordered on performance art. I attached receipts, time-stamped photos of the bulldozer on my property line, and the delivery slip signed by Frank. No leaks, no noise, no obstruction, I wrote. Stored temporarily with owner's permission while repairs are made following neighbor's accidental destruction of my fence. Happy to provide further details. City Code Enforcement sent a generic acknowledgement and then went silent, which told me what I needed to know. They'd seen Karen's name before. Meanwhile, Karen shifted tactics. She called an emergency neighborhood meeting at her house. I was, naturally, not invited. I watched from my porch as people trickled in, mostly the folks who only showed up to vote on Halloween candy guidelines or garden gnome restrictions. There was a lot of wild gesturing, hands on hips, and more than one awkward glance in my direction. I waved, friendly as ever. By the end, a couple of neighbors peeled away and came straight to me. Mrs. Alvarez brought banana bread and leaned in conspiratorially. "Don't worry about her," she said. "She tried to convince us you were setting up a demolition derby. We all saw the Jeep tracks. She's just embarrassed." As if to punctuate her words, Karen posted a rant to the neighborhood Facebook group titled, "Urgent Community Safety Alert." It warned of potentially dangerous machinery, accused me of hostile intimidation tactics, and ended with a call to restore our peaceful way of life. Underneath, most replies were gifs of bulldozers or people eating popcorn. Karen doubled down, replying to every comment, but her usual acolytes stayed quiet. When someone finally posted a meme of her Jeep crushing a picket fence, the thread turned into a comedy roast. I screenshotted everything, just in case, but public humiliation only made her more determined. The next morning, I caught sight of her out front, marching up and down her driveway with a tape measure and a camera. She took dozens of photos from every angle, some of her garden, others of the bulldozer's treads. That afternoon, a truck arrived. She'd hired a landscaping crew, complete with safety vests and a foreman who looked about 12. They staked out the border between our properties and erected a temporary privacy wall made of plastic lattice and zip ties, the kind you might use to keep rabbits out of a vegetable patch. It looked more like a set for a kid's puppet show than an actual barrier. Still, she fussed over every detail, instructing the workers like she was directing a military operation. When I waved, she glared, then held up a sign that said, "No trespassing, under video surveillance." I could see her phone propped in a window, recording every move. That evening, I received a certified letter. Karen had filed for a restraining order against me, over the bulldozer. The letter was thick with accusations: deliberate intimidation, weaponizing construction equipment, and threatening community safety. There was even a line about emotional trauma due to ongoing exposure to machinery. I shook my head in disbelief. Her tactics had escalated from sabotage to full-blown legal theater. Still, I knew a judge would laugh her out of the building, but I forwarded everything to my actual lawyer, my cousin Jamie, who handled real estate disputes and, more importantly, loved a good story. Jamie called that night, barely able to stop laughing. Is she for real? This reads like a rejected script from Judge Judy. You're fine. But document everything. If she wants a fight, she's gonna get bored when nobody comes to her parade. By midweek, the bulldozer had become a symbol. Parents brought their kids by to take photos. Teenagers filmed TikToks pretending to operate it. A local blogger wrote up the neighborhood showdown and posted a poll: Team Karen or Team Bulldozer? The results were not close. Karen stewed, barely leaving her house except to bark orders at the landscapers, who were now constructing a second, taller wall made of painted plywood and metal posts. It blocked the bulldozer from her sight but also cast half her front garden into permanent shade. Some poetic justice, I thought. But then came her boldest move yet. Thursday morning, a tow truck arrived. I watched, speechless, as Karen directed the driver to back into my property and prepare to haul the bulldozer away. The driver, a young guy with a clipboard, looked uneasy. I walked up, calm but not smiling. "Can I help you?" I asked. He glanced at Karen, then back at me. Ma'am says this is an abandoned vehicle and needs to be removed." I pulled out my paperwork and my phone, ready to call Frank. "That's not happening," I said. "It's on my property, legally delivered. And I'm calling the cops if you touch it." Karen marched over, voice shrill. "You're blocking access to my driveway." I looked at the tow truck driver. "It's not blocking anything. You see a problem?" He looked at the narrow space, then shook his head. "Not my fight." He got back in his truck and left, Karen fuming beside the curb. The next few days were a tug-of-war in miniature. Karen upped her social media campaign, posting blurry photos of the bulldozer at every hour, tagging city officials and local news. She even staged a safety inspection, inviting a retired fireman, her cousin, to walk around with a clipboard, pointing gravely at imaginary hazards. Meanwhile, I made steady progress on my new fence, turning down offers of help but accepting all the cookies. Every board I put up was a silent message: I'm not going anywhere. On Friday, I took down her lattice wall. She'd built it on my side of the line, and set it, neatly stacked, on her porch with a note: "Thanks for the decor." But the week wasn't over. Late Friday night, I heard shouting from Karen's driveway. Her Jeep, the mighty destroyer of fences, was boxed in by the bulldozer, a neighbor's car, and, miraculously, her own landscaper's truck. She paced in circles, yelling into her phone, while a small crowd gathered to watch the latest drama. I stood back, arms crossed, and caught her eye. "You want me to move the bulldozer?" I asked, loud enough for the. By Saturday morning, the neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what Karen would do next. Even my dog seemed to sense that something weird was in the air. She kept glancing at the window every time a car rolled past, as if expecting another parade of tow trucks or city officials. After a week of skirmishes, paperwork, and public drama, I was almost surprised to step outside and see Karen's front yard eerily quiet. No landscapers, no banners, no HOA-style rallies. Just the bulldozer gleaming in her driveway, reflecting the early sun, perfectly blocking the path between her Jeep and the street. I watered my new fence, already looking 100 times sturdier than the old one, and tried not to flinch as Karen's curtains twitched with every movement I made. It didn't take long for the next act. Around mid-morning, a black SUV pulled up and a man in a suit stepped out, clutching a clipboard and a briefcase. He strode up Karen's walk like he owned the place and knocked so hard the porch gnome nearly toppled. A few minutes later, Karen burst onto her porch in full battle regalia. A crisp pantsuit, sunglasses perched high, hair teased into submission, clutching a folder that looked thick enough to bludgeon someone with. They exchanged a few tense words. She pointed at the bulldozer, at my house, at her Jeep, arms flailing for emphasis. The man nodded, jotted notes, and snapped several photos, always from angles that made the bulldozer look like it had been dropped from space to terrorize her property. As he left, he made a beeline for my porch. He introduced himself as Mark Riley, a private dispute mediator, hired by Karen to help de-escalate a pattern of neighborhood intimidation and property disputes. The way he said it, you could tell he'd heard the phrase more times than he cared to count. I invited him to sit, poured coffee, and explained everything, every board, every tire mark, every city inspector who'd come and gone. Mark listened, asked for receipts, and took his own set of photos, this time making sure to get both sides of the property line. He glanced at my new fence, nodded approvingly, and said, "You know, I get called in for some ridiculous things. But this might be my first bulldozer standoff." We shared a chuckle, and I got the sense that his report would be a lot more balanced than Karen had hoped. Karen must have watched us, because soon she was back in her yard, phone in hand, narrating a live Facebook video to her dwindling followers. "I am standing here, once again, because my neighbor has weaponized industrial machinery to harass me and block my access," she declared, zooming in on the bulldozer and then dramatically panning to her Jeep, which sat at an absurd, useless angle. "This is the third time I've been a victim of deliberate intimidation." She paused, as if remembering to look teary, then shot me a glare over the top of her sunglasses. I waved cheerfully at the camera. "Morning, Karen. Beautiful day for a stalemate." That went viral locally, especially after a teenager in the neighborhood clipped it and posted it to TikTok with a soundtrack of The Imperial March. Suddenly my phone was buzzing with messages, screenshots, and memes featuring the bulldozer, Karen, and increasingly creative photoshops involving monster trucks, tank battles, and even a Godzilla lurking in the background. The narrative had officially left Karen's control, and for once the neighborhood was laughing at her, not with her. By noon, another car rolled up. This time a city code enforcement officer I'd never seen before. She was young, professional, and looked like she had no patience for nonsense. She examined the bulldozer, took photos, measured its distance from the street, and asked a few routine questions. I showed her my paperwork, explained the fence incident again, and watched as her eyes glazed over by the third mention of accidental vehicular property destruction. She left with a tight-lipped smile and the assurance that, as long as the bulldozer was not leaking fluids or blocking emergency access, I was perfectly within my rights. Karen, who'd been eavesdropping from her porch, looked ready to explode. She marched over as soon as the officer was gone, flapping her file folder so aggressively I thought she might achieve flight. "You know, I have half a mind to call the news," she said. "Go for it," I replied. "Just make sure you get my good side." She stormed off again, but I could see the cracks forming. For the first time, Karen looked genuinely rattled. That afternoon, things got weirder. A moving van pulled up to Karen's driveway. For a split second, I thought she was packing up, but instead, 3 workers began hauling out boxes, armfuls of kitchenware, and a weird assortment of knickknacks and framed motivational posters. Karen hovered behind them, barking instructions and clutching what looked like a binder labeled legal evidence. When I asked if she was moving, she snapped, "Of course not. I'm staging the house for a possible sale. I can't live like this, with heavy equipment, noise, and harassment. Who would buy this house now?" I almost felt bad, except that she was the one who'd started the demolition derby. The parade of visitors didn't stop. By evening, a local TV crew had indeed shown up, thanks to Karen's tip. She tried to position herself in front of the bulldozer for a dramatic live interview, but the reporter, clearly briefed by the meme flood, asked more questions about her Jeep incident than about my supposed campaign of terror. She grew increasingly shrill as the camera rolled, eventually shouting about toxic masculinity and weaponized landscaping. The segment ended up running on the late news, but the station's social media manager clipped the interview and ran it as a quirky neighbor feud, pairing Karen's quotes with footage of the bulldozer and my quietly thriving new fence. By nightfall, the neighborhood's group chat was on fire. Someone posted a screenshot from the news, captioned Karen's monster truck rally. Another neighbor dropped off a cake decorated with a tiny fondant bulldozer and the words, "Welcome to the block." The whole community seemed to be uniting around the absurdity of it all, with Karen's antics becoming a kind of rallying point against her. But Karen wasn't finished. Not even close. Late that night, I heard a new noise outside. Metal scraping, something shifting in the dark. I peered through the blinds and spotted Karen, flashlight in hand, creeping around the bulldozer. She stopped at the blade, measuring tape dangling from her wrist, muttering to herself as she tried to wedge a cardboard sign under one tread. I watched in disbelief as she planted a "private property, no trespassing" placard in the grass, then took several flash photos like she was documenting a crime scene. I went out, calm as ever, coffee mug in hand. "Evening, Karen. Bit late for yard work, isn't it?" She whirled around, flashlight beam catching me in the eyes. "I'm gathering evidence," she said, voice wavering. "You're going to pay for all of this." She looked so desperate, so defeated, that for a moment I almost felt sorry. Almost. "Karen, you drove through my fence with your Jeep. All I did was park a bulldozer in a driveway you already trashed. This whole thing could have ended days ago." She stared at me, chest heaving, searching for words. Finally she snapped, "Just wait. You'll regret this. You and everyone who thinks this is funny." She stomped back to her porch, leaving the "no trespassing" sign behind. I woke Sunday to a neighborhood transformed. The story had become something bigger than me, Karen, or even the bulldozer now hulking silently in her driveway. People walked their dogs past our houses with the kind of furtive anticipation you'd see before a parade or a fireworks show. Someone had tied a blue ribbon around the bulldozer's blade. A group of teenagers had written "Fence Patrol" in sidewalk chalk down the curb. The group chat was already buzzing by dawn. The night before, the local news segment had been picked up by a national morning show, and a screenshot of Karen's outburst was spreading like wildfire, racking up tens of thousands of views and a hashtag bulldoze the drama. Through all of this, I kept my routine calm and measured. I brewed my coffee, took my dog out, and inspected my new fence for the 100th time. It stood sturdy and silent, a quiet monument to the war that had started with a Jeep and a lapse of judgment. As I rounded the corner, I saw Karen's living room lights already blazing. She paced in front of the window, phone clamped to her ear, binder open on the coffee table. I almost felt a pang of sympathy, but she'd earned every headline, every meme, every awkward stare. By mid-morning, the escalation I'd expected finally arrived. A white city truck rolled up, the kind with a municipal seal and a pair of clipboard-wielding inspectors inside. Karen practically sprinted out to meet them, folder in hand, pointing so wildly at the bulldozer that one inspector had to sidestep her to avoid being poked in the chest. I kept my distance, sipping coffee, watching as the inspectors measured, photographed, and scribbled in silence. Karen hovered over them, narrating every action into her phone, broadcasting live to whoever was left in her audience. One inspector broke away and came over, flipping open a notepad. "Morning. We're following up on some complaints about a code violation and unauthorized construction equipment," she said, her tone neutral. "Can I see your permit and delivery papers?" I handed her everything. Frank's delivery slip, the receipts for fence repair, my correspondence with the city, photos of the fence wreckage. She nodded, flipping through with the calm detachment of someone who'd seen it all. "And you're aware this is a temporary storage while you rebuild the fence?" I nodded. She peered over at Karen, who was now mid-rant. "You've got 48 hours to move it just to keep things clean for the city," she said quietly. But off the record, nice fence. Karen overheard, face falling as she realized she hadn't won the knockout she'd hoped for. The inspectors wrapped up and left, leaving Karen alone in the yard, shoulders slumped but not beaten. She stared at the bulldozer, then at me, then retreated inside, slamming her door so hard it rattled her porch railing. I expected her to launch a fresh round of Facebook posts, but this time, the digital echo chamber was quieter. The memes had moved on, and the crowd was tired of her drama. I spent the rest of the day hauling new boards, finishing the last section of fence, and chatting with neighbors who wandered over to see the spectacle. Mrs. Alvarez brought lemonade, Mr. Holland joked about starting a bulldozer rental business, and even the teen crowd pitched in to help, more for the story than the labor. Karen, meanwhile, kept a low profile, blinds drawn, only coming out once to glare at us before retreating again. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the houses, the biggest twist of all arrived. A trio of black SUVs rolled up, unmarked, government plates, all business. Out stepped a small squad of city officials and, behind them, two men in shirt sleeves who looked like they'd never smiled in their lives. Karen came out in a flash, face lit with the hope that this was finally her cavalry. Instead, the lead official marched up my driveway, flashed his badge, and introduced himself as a representative of the city's Risk Management and Public Works Department. "We've reviewed the video evidence, property lines, and complaints," he said briskly. "We'd like to see where your property begins and ends, if you don't mind." We walked the line together, tape measure in hand, as the sun painted everything gold. I showed him the survey markers, receipts for the new fence, every scrap of evidence I'd compiled since the first morning Karen's Jeep turned my yard into a war zone. The official was methodical, respectful, and thorough. After half an hour, he turned to Karen, who had followed us, wringing her hands. "Ma'am, we've concluded the bulldozer is entirely on your driveway, not the city's right-of-way or any utility easement. It's private property. If you want it gone, that's a civil matter between you and your neighbor. As far as the city is concerned, this is resolved." Karen's jaw dropped. "You're just going to let him park a bulldozer in front of my house? After everything I've told you?" The official sighed. "He's within his rights. Unless the property owner files a complaint, it's not a city issue." Karen turned on me, eyes blazing. "Fine. Then I'll sue. I'll sue everyone on this block." But even her voice sounded tired. There was no audience left to cheer her on. After the officials left, Karen stood on her porch, alone, binder drooping at her side. I almost said something, an olive branch, a joke, a truce. But she just shook her head and went inside, and for the first time, it didn't feel like an ending so much as a surrender. The next morning, I called Frank. By noon, the bulldozer was gone, hauled away with all the ceremony of a departing parade float. Neighbors came out to watch, snapping photos, making jokes about starting a neighborhood heavy equipment show. I put the last nail in the fence, stepped back, and surveyed the yard. It looked whole again, maybe even better than before. The scars left by Karen's Jeep were gone, replaced with clean lines and sturdy boards. Karen kept to herself after that. The group chat drifted back to mundane things. Lost cats, street cleaning, who'd left their garbage cans out. Occasionally, I'd see her staring out the window, binder gone, face softer. Sometimes I wondered if the whole mess had finally taught her something about the cost of being right all the time. Or maybe it just tired her out. Either way, peace returned in its own odd way. But the story lived on. Someone started selling t-shirts with #BulldozTheDrama printed over a cartoon fence and bulldozer. Every time I wore mine, I got a knowing nod from someone on the block. Even Frank dropped by to laugh about it, asking if I needed a backhoe next time Karen stepped out of line. We joked, but everyone knew the real win wasn't the fence or the memes. It was the neighborhood learning to stand up to the loudest voice. When you show a bully that you won't be moved, not by threats, by lawsuits, or even a Jeep, they shrink down to normal size. One evening, as dusk settled over the street, I saw Karen in her yard. She nodded at me, just once, not friendly but not hostile, and went back inside. That was enough. The war was over. The fence was up. And, for the first time since I moved in, the block actually felt like home.